Hello and welcome everyone to our conversation today on algorithms and democracy. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy and director of the Now History and Principles of Democracy Lab. I want to thank Jessica Kimple-Johnson and Joshua Gravely who have helped us put together this event. This is the first in a series of events in the fall around Touchstones of Democracy. We'll have another event in a few weeks on open democracy with political theorists thinking about questions of representation, and then later an event on the Chilean constitutional reform underway. I'm going to introduce our guests. One of our guests, I will warn you, is having a little trouble connecting, Nicole Turner-Lee, so we are waiting to have her join us, but Anton Korinek is here already, so we will begin with him. I am going to do the introductions for both of them, and then we're very hopeful Nicole will be able to join soon. So first I'll introduce Anton. Hello, Anton, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Anton Korinek is professor in the Department of Economics and at the Darden School of Business here at the University of Virginia, as well as a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He works on the implications of artificial intelligence for business, economy, and the future of society, engaging with questions of inequality as well. He's a research associate at NBER and at the CEPR at the Oxford Center for the Governance of AI, and editor of the Oxford Handbook of AI Governance. Many publications, co-authors with really a wide range of economists. I'll just mention that along with Martin Schindler and Joseph Stiglitz, he recently completed an article called Technological Progress, Artificial Intelligence and Inclusive Growth. So welcome, Anton. I will introduce Nicole so that she can join us when she comes on as well. Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution and co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. She's a researcher on public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology in the US and to harness its power to create change in communities around the world. She's interested in global and domestic broadband deployment and internet governance issues, and looks at the intersection of race, wealth, technology, and the concept of civic engagement, criminal justice, and economic development. She also wanted us to mention that she's published an article in the Oxford Handbook of Governance called Mitigating Algorithmic Biases Through Incentive-Based Rating Systems, and also a policy link article called It's Time for an Updated Big Tech Civil Rights Regime. I do also want to mention that her book, Digital Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, was published this summer by the Brookings Institution. We'll put a link to that as well in the chat as we move along. The way this will work is we'll be in conversation with our guests for about 30-35 minutes, raising some broad questions, and then we'll invite you to share Q&A questions through the Q&A function that I'll pose to them as well. So thank you, Anton. Hopefully welcoming Nicole soon. Since we're talking about technology, of course, there's a technological problem. But I wanted to invite you, Anton, to help us first with a very basic question that I think some in our audience may know the answer to, but I'm not sure that I fully know the answer to, which is, can you explain to us really what is an algorithm? How do you define it? How do you study it? How do you think about an algorithm?
Thank you for having me here, Laurent. And yes, this is indeed a really good question to kick it off with. I thought, just to be sure, let me go to the Oxford Dictionary and see what they have to say about algorithms. And they say, and I read kind of an excerpt of that, an algorithm is a process or a set of rules to be followed in problem-solving operations. Okay. And interestingly, if you think about it in this very broad way, a process or set of rules in solving problems, we can actually even think of democracy itself as an algorithm. It's a process through which we as a democratic society establish the rules and decide what decisions we want to make about collective choices, collective actions.
Does the definition, though, imply a certain kind of either computing or artificial intelligence application of those rules? Or would you say that individuals can apply algorithms in social structures as well? Or is it, that's what I'm curious, is it related to technology, or do you think do we kind of operate according to algorithms in many other realms of social life?
Traditionally, when we hear the word algorithms, we of course think of computers. But I think the analogy that I wanted to point out is if you think about the way our democracy works, that every citizen casts a vote, and then we count the votes and we decide basically which side of a particular question wins, then this is in some sense also a social algorithm.
Right,
And
right.
I was actually planning to expand a little bit more on this view of democracy within our broader governance ecosystem, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, well, that would be wonderful, actually. I mean, my next question was really to sort of say, what should concern us or interest us about the role of algorithms and perhaps their increasing role on some level in different forms of our social life for the problem of democracy, right? How does this influence democracy itself?
Yeah, it influences it in really drastic and significant ways. And I thought for my opening remarks, I wanted to take a little bit of a broad perspective on our governance system. And I wanted to start essentially with, how should I say, a highly stylized, but I still hope useful perspective on how a governance ecosystem, including ours, work and how it has traditionally been influenced by new technologies. And now the algorithms that I think we mostly have in mind when we talk about algorithms and democracy, which are social media algorithms, recommender systems, they are essentially an extremely powerful version of this manifestation of the role of algorithms in governance. So if I may, I thought it would be useful for me to share a small, almost cartoonish figure of how governance works that I drew with my fellow editor, Justin Bullock, and actually one of our students at UVA to illustrate governance in a kind of cartoonish way for the introduction of the Oxford Handbook of AI Governance that both Nicole and I have contributed to and that you have already mentioned earlier. So let me briefly share that picture. So if we start from essentially pre-modern times, governance was really a pretty simple process. We had a group of humans, and that's illustrated here in this simple picture. And those humans needed to make collective decisions together. But in pre-modern times, let's say, for example, within a tribe or something like that, that really wasn't all that difficult. Now, over time, new technologies emerged and allowed us to coordinate our information flows more and more and basically to establish larger groups of humans via new structures. And we kind of illustrated that in a second graph like this. So we have new structures, governments illustrated kind of by a dome of Congress in the center. We had structures like businesses, organizations, factories, and all of these played an increasing role in how we govern our society. Now, more broadly, we can think of these additional structures that we have here now as artificial entities. They were created by humans in order to coordinate our society a little bit more differently. And I think you may already be guessing where I'm going next. So we have established these new organizations already for a few hundred years. But what has changed more recently is that algorithms, AI systems, have played an increasing role in the process. So to make it tangible, here in this picture, we are illustrating the algorithms or AI systems by little robots, because an algorithm itself is not a tangible thing. Now, as the figure illustrates, these algorithms are really playing an increasing role in all of our organizations. And that is what makes this question of whether our algorithms are fair, whether they refrain from bias and other questions like that, which I hope we will be discussing with Nicole shortly, that the algorithms work properly. So this is the third picture. Now, as these algorithms become ever more powerful, there is a risk that they will also grow in importance in our governance structures. And I'll fast forward to what may be one of the potentially dystopic outcomes for our governance system. That would be a picture like this. Mm. So this is not really where we want to go. But if we don't correct course, I think there is a risk that we may go in this direction, that algorithms kind of almost take over our governance ecosystem. And if we don't steer those algorithms in the right direction, then the role for human choices and for human agency may risk being severely diminished. I'll end it here, and I see that Nicole has just joined us. So let me stop my screen sharing with these figures.
Nicole, welcome.
Thank you. I thought I was in Zoom prison. I could not get past the firewall.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I'm here now. And I know my dear colleague filled in the blanks in the white space, so thank you.
He did so wonderfully, and we really are just getting started thinking about defining algorithms, and so welcome and thank you. Whenever you talk about technology, you have to have a technological problem. So the Zoom algorithms were taking their revenge, I guess, or something. But
I tell you, I think I've done so many of them. They're like, "Please, lady, leave us alone." It was so weird. Like, I've never had this happen before, but Joshua was very helpful, so I'm glad.
Okay, great. So we were just talking about the kind of increasing power of algorithms, right, in our society, and Anton had kind of laid out this idea of democracy itself as a kind of algorithm, but I think just ended with this potentially dystopian outcome. And I want to maybe dwell there a little bit before we can then talk a little bit potentially about solutions and the kind of work you're trying to do. One question I guess I have is sort of about agency, right, which is, who makes the algorithms? Or do the algorithms at this point, are they themselves in some kind of control, I guess, right? So are humans controlling what algorithms are doing, or are algorithms starting to control what humans are doing, I suppose, to go with the dystopic sense? And I wonder if you can kind of unpack that for us, where are they coming from and who's in control, or are we in control?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, the work that I do at Brookings as a director of the Center for Technology Innovation and the person who leads our algorithmic bias work, I think that's a great question, right? Because we are so inundated by these machine learning algorithms that I don't think we know when they start and when they stop. I just recorded a podcast for our Tech Tank podcast that we do as part of the center that I run. And I was suggesting that there's no on and off switch, right? That from everything from movie recommendations to purchasing recommendations to even how we vote is in some way influenced by a machine learning computational model. And how that is basically because we're seeing these computational models sort of pick up on our inferences, our digital profiles, our composite behaviors, and really with the preciseness in advertising, essentially, find us and target us. So I do like your question. I do think in many respects, we live in an algorithmic economy, which we have no agency over. And it's unfortunate because there's convenience in this algorithmic economy. I mean, I'm pretty happy that I don't have to go into a big box store because they already know what I want. So they basically send me the right ads at the right time. So I'm not finding myself inundated through the aisles. But the same token, that same algorithm also knows that I'm a Black woman who changes my hairstyle, that may shop, often. And as a result of that, makes determinations on my credit worthiness or whether or not, I should be giving this interest rate or I should see this online layaway program. And so I think people don't really know, and I use this now, how the sausage is made. And as a result of that, we're sort of passive consumers of this algorithmic economy that has gone way above the line outside of movie recommendations to even like the political candidates that we choose to actually endorse.
If I may, I will add a little bit to this perspective, and that comes now specifically from my background as an economist. So I think one of the interesting things, and Nicole has emphasized that we have lost some of our agency, and part of that is that the algorithms are, of course, technically programmed by humans, but oftentimes market forces kind of drive what their orientation is. So if we take, for example, the algorithms of systems like Facebook, they are maximizing what they call user engagement, or what we may also want to call hooking users. They want to make you as addicted as possible because that allows them to serve more ads and earn more revenue. And from an economic perspective, this is kind of a classic externality. They do damage to our society, but in a way that maximizes their profits.
Right.
So it's kind of like the market system driving the algorithms to do these things to our democracy that are really noxious and that have so many adverse effects. And yeah, that's one of the fundamental problems.
Although I want to be a little bit more positive because I think we always have like a very dystopian look at computational models. Listen, if it had not been for AI, we would not have had the expeditious emergency authorization of the COVID vaccine, right? A lot of that was based on AI models that were completely repetitive in their testing of these molecular structures to get to where we are today when it comes to the vaccination. Climate change is another area. You know, there are other age-defined technologies that are helping us find lost parents that have strayed away. The key thing is who has the agency, right? And a lot of research right now, as we've been talking about, the algorithmic economy is sort of this unbalanced alignment of power. And so the people, as Anton said, who create this technology basically are the ones that are driving the predictive decision-making capacity. In my work, for example, the people who are creating this technology do not look like me. That's a problem, right? In terms of workforce diversity. And so they're not necessarily capturing what I call my lived experiences. And so appropriately for the University of Virginia, of which I have a child there, I don't know if he's watching, my friend Renee Cummings, who's a criminologist there, basically says that the algorithm is trained on historically traumatized data, which means that it's the data that is basically reflecting the systemic inequalities that we have in society. And so to one extent, we're seeing some really great stuff come out of these models. On the other extent, there's some pernicious stuff, as my colleague has suggested. The question is the role of the private market in that decision-making. And I think that's where it gets very, to say it pretty easily, funky, because you have private agencies creating the discourse. And that's where I think we have challenges as who makes that decision. And as Mark Zuckerberg said a few years ago, he is not trying to be the arbiter of truth, but he is using these platforms to drive certain types of decision-making that I think we're all concerned about today.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up, one of the really interesting things when you listen to, for example, interviews of Mark Zuckerberg is he seems to feel that he's under this tremendous competitive pressure that reduces his agency. Mm-hmm. And maybe he's a little bit underestimating his agency there. But I think what it illustrates is that, yeah, we do really need some regulation of these forces. Mm-hmm.
That's really fascinating. And thank you for laying that out. It sounds like partly right that the algorithm gives the market a particularly strong role in the public sphere, is the way we might put it, right? So, I mean, one of the things that happens in a democratic society, right, is that the ability to influence people, to influence voters in a democracy, it becomes a route to power, a very important form, and to influence people's mentalities and their thinking. So it sounds like there's just this form of influence that has been developed, that it's not necessarily a complete sea change from what we had before. We've always had mechanisms through the press or other ways of influencing people, but there's something about it. And I wonder if we could identify, I mean, are there things about the way algorithms work that changes the flow of information? Is it the speed? Is it the sort of targeting and marketing of things? What would you say about algorithms are perhaps both maybe the most problematic and potentially also promising in terms of literal democratic practice?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, first and foremost, the algorithm, I think, cuts across what we've traditionally had as federally protected categories, right? So where we actually have sort of mitigated and litigated out certain attributes that we have to be sensitive about. We've actually have what Michael Kearns has called sort of these inferential attributes, which are the algorithm's ability to, again, piece together pieces of your digital life and to come up with particular assumptions around how you're going to behave. So I love, for example, blue dresses on a beautiful spring semester. You're going to find me in a lot of blue. Well, the algorithm knows that, and the algorithm feeds off of that purchasing behavior. And challenge is the algorithm also knows I have a daughter. The algorithm also knows the hues of the dolls that I buy for her. The algorithm knows what time of the night, what kind of computer, as our colleague Aaron Klein talks about. If you're a person who uses a Mac, you have a higher likelihood of getting credit versus somebody who uses a PC. That becomes a challenge of this for the democracy. What we found in sort of the voter suppression that happened in 2016 is that they took it at two angles. They knew this preciseness of the inferential economy that was defined by our digital profiles and our digital lives. And then they took advantage of the historical trauma that we have as a country when it comes to the tribalization among races and ethnicities and the variety of demographics that make us different as voters. And so what you saw, people don't remember, is you saw, for example, Democrats who were trying to go towards Hillary. You saw Russian operatives basically darken her skin, make her look scarier to discourage Black voters from going to the polls. Research suggests that it wasn't a huge dent, but there was a study that came out maybe a year later of Black men that was sitting in Detroit who basically said when they received those types of images on Facebook, it discouraged them from voting for her and voting Democrat. And so that led to a certain extent to the election of Trump. My point is, when you're starting to look at the type of granularity that comes with these algorithmic models, you have to be worried. We have a voting rights law that unfortunately under the 2016 algorithmic suppression could not be seen as case law because we've never seen anything like this in terms of external manipulation of our democratic process. But we continue to see that, and we see this greater precision of being able to identify without people actually consenting to that identification or attribute, where it's actually the exploitation continues to occur. So to me, that's the part, and at Brookings, that's what I work on. I work on the violation of civil rights and human liberties as a result of the granularity of discrimination that happens through these models. The same token, I grew up when George Jetson and Fred Flintstone were on TV. And the optimization of technology wasn't reality when I was a child running home to watch those cartoons on a Saturday morning. Fred Flintstone, for those of you from UVA, rode around with rocks as wheels in his car. George Jetson rode around with autonomous vehicles. The promise of these models is that we actually see this. In my lifetime, I never thought I would see an autonomous vehicle. I never thought I would see a drone. I never thought I would see a lot of these things. And so the question becomes, can you use these for the public good? And I think that's where this conversation we're having right now, we as a society don't know what to do with this discourse because the technical people are sort of running the show. And most of us are passive observers or bystanders, or actually we are the attribute of the model. And so we sort of submit to our attribution to the development of these models without knowing what these models are actually doing.
Thank you. Anton, I'm just going to say, I'm going to step back a little while. I know that you have talked a lot together, so I'm going to let you converse for a while and then come back.
You sure you don't want to join this party? No.
Yeah, it's such a great, I know you have a lot to discuss, so that's how we had decided we'd do this little next phase. I'll come back when it's time to start fielding questions, but please continue this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laurent, for kicking off the interesting conversation. What I wanted to pick up on what Nicole last said is, in some ways, this increasing prevalence of algorithms, it really forces us to kind of re-examine our basic view of what it means to be human. So in some ways, a caricature version, which I think was enough for a lot of applications, a few decades ago, before we had these powerful algorithms. And it is a caricature version that's particularly prevalent. And I take some fault for that as an economist. We liked to believe in everybody being perfectly rational. But what it turns out is that these algorithms are so adept at manipulating us. And basically, I want to use a phrase that Yuval Harari has employed, at hacking our brain. Yeah. And making us do things that we would not do if we hadn't been targeted by that algorithm. And
But although I want to jump in on that,
yeah,
though.
please do.
I'm a sociologist. I don't hold it against you that you're an economist, but I'm a sociologist. You know, listen, we did a study a couple of years ago about when Zuckerberg did come out with that comment about how technology was going to bring people closer together, and we're going to see all these like social networks. As a sociologist, I was sort of raised on Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, you know, where we actually found the discombobulation of bowling leagues and people coming together on their front porch, basically going into this very isolated society where we operated as individual entities within communities. No more block clubs and, you know, neighborhood watch groups, really people out for themselves. What I think has happened, actually, to your point, is I think the technology really represents who we are as a country. It's the ugly truth of who we are. It allows people to find their own space. And we used to call it, and we called it in this paper at Brookings a couple of years ago, we actually tested this assertion, can you build communities through technology? Well, we found out you can't, because people, the technology is designed in such a way where you align, you show affinity towards the things that you show outside of technology. And so you saw greater tribalization, greater filter bubbles. And I think that translated in the recent years where we've seen these white supremacist groups that have found a home on the internet in particular, because it's allowed people to stay within their bubble, much like we see the type of tribalization and polarization that we see today. So I do think it's like, I think it's, I'm responding to your comment. I think this is actually us. Computers don't discriminate and program themselves. We do this. And this technology, to some extent, has not broken or recalibrated our own models. So when you say the technology is human, yes, it's human and it's fallible. And I think that's the part from my research that I consistently deal with. There are explicit and implicit biases that are built into these technologies that most of my engineering friends would say, yeah, they may be there, but the science is objective and it reduces some of that discrimination.
Nicole, you have just brought up a keyword in your research. We have just had the pleasure of taking your paper in the Oxford Handbook of AI Governance. And I thought in that paper, you really propose a very neat solution, or at least partial solution. We know this is a complex space, right, to this whole problem. Would you care to tell us a little bit more about your proposal?
Yeah, you know, look, I'm hopefully not scaring everybody watching today because I deal with this all the time with AI. And it allows me to have my own inquiry as a scholar at Brookings, but also as a PhD who's worked on these issues of inequality and inclusiveness. So I just put out this chapter in a book, which I'm really excited about, working with you guys. It is proposing like a mitigation strategy to everything that we're talking about. So I've been doing this for about 3 to 4 years, and every panel, I'm that person that comes in and says, we need to do more about this for the protection of human and civil rights. And as I've been doing this work, I have found that we've discussed bias as a normative construct. And so if we know it's normative and it occurs to me that we need pragmatic solutions. And so what I've recently put out is what I think is a pragmatic solution that, to Laurent's question, brings more agency back into this model development as well as the model implementation. So a couple of years ago, I bought a dishwasher and my dishwasher had broken, and I went to a big box store looking for a dishwasher, true story. And I ran across this big yellow sticker that was what is called an Energy Star rating. And for those of us that are looking for consumer appliances, there is a governing body that is a collaboration between the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, and multiple industry as well as federal state level entities and consumer groups that basically come up with the technical and operational cadence and the extent to which these consumer appliances are optimized for efficiency. And I said to myself, we don't have this for algorithms, right? When it comes to accountability, we sort of push forward with permissionless innovation, and then we come back with permissionless forgiveness. I didn't know that I was going to suppress the vote of millions of Black voters. I did not know that people were going to be denied credit based on this model. And so my idea was to improve upon the usability, Anton, of NIST, who basically goes through industry certified standards, that we need something that is based on perhaps an incentive-based rating system or something that is a better housekeeping seal of approval for users like you and I. And what that means, and I'll stop here, it means that there will be a discussion of standards, a discussion of product disclosures, particularly when there are inefficiencies like facial recognition and the lighting that I'm in right now, because I think we're going to have a storm soon. Facial recognition system would not recognize me. They do not recognize Black women with darker skin tones. They misidentify us sometimes with Black men when we change our hair. And so in my model, you would tell people that, that there are certain inadequacies that happen with this technology that people should be aware of. The other thing I'm proposing in this model is that you need to ask consumers if the model itself is performing the way it's designed to do. So when I go back to my blue dress example, you should ask me, are you getting as many blue dresses as possible to simplify it? But you should also ask me, is this leading you to other advertisements or other offers that are potentially not what you asked for? And so in my research towards this model, I talked about 7 to 8 companies. And what was interesting is overly regulated companies and sectors like financial services are very heavily invested in making sure that there's technical efficiency with their models. Because if they're not, they will be fined by the banking regulators and potentially be perceived as offering disparate impact, discrimination that under the banking laws is illegal. But among other developers, you don't see that type of operational diligence. And to me, you need something, just like when we go to the bank as private citizens, we know when we hand our deposit to the teller, it's going to go in the vault. We don't know that right now in terms of the accountability of these systems. And so for me, I'm trying to figure out, and thank you for asking, in this model, I'm basically proposing, do we need some signature validation that imports consumer agency, while at the same time is not necessarily enforceable by penalty, but allows the industry with other partners to raise the bar when it comes to how they're hovering over very high-risk algorithms, credit, employment, healthcare, education. So I don't apply it to just general algorithms. I don't want, a streaming company to come back to me and say, hey, we just gave an Energy Star rating that you watch too many love stories. That's not the intent of this. The intent is when we're going down areas which are high risk, are we giving consumers trust that there's been some scrutiny and interrogation of these models before they go to market or while they're in the marketplace?
Yeah, that is, I think, a really important initiative. I've heard that bodies like NIST and so on are trying to really look into AI. And, I'm a European. In Europe, there has already been, I would say, probably more progress on this than in the US with like the EU Digital Services Act and now the EU AI Act that's under discussion. And they specifically provide for basically things like audits and legal requirements, enforceable requirements that algorithms are not biased when they are, as you say, algorithms of importance that matter for hiring decisions, for credit decisions, and things like that. What's your sense about the take-up in the US? Do you think we are gonna see some progress on that in the near future?
I would like to say yes, but I don't think so. Right? I think the problem in the US is we do not have a federal privacy umbrella that allows us to start this conversation of dictating what variables are on and off limits. And so in the EU, they were very progressive in pushing the general data protection rules, which provides the framing of what data should be used to be imported and training data for these models. Here in the US, we have more state by state legislation, and we're enthralled right now in, I think, a congressional battle as to what this legislation should say. So we do have the American Data Privacy Protection Act, which is actually, hopefully, I think it's going to be an executive order sometime next week, from what I hear. But the bottom line is we need a framework for privacy legislation to help us in this area of algorithmic inputs. With that being said, I think there's this idea in the US that there should still be free agency because of free market. And so as a result, there have been 20 bills on algorithmic accountability that have been put forth in the last 2 to 3 years, but we've not seen any of these pass with great success. And they've been basically talking about the same things. I think what the EU has done, which I would love to see imported in the United States, is if we're not going to apply the same type of regulatory constraint that the EU is doing, we should at least have definitions. We should be able to at least categorize some algorithms of high or lower risk, red or green. We've done this in other cases, and in cases where we've seen high risk, and you know this, we've gone and used regulatory sandboxes and safe harbors to do some more co-evolutionary work. We did that with fintech, tried to work with tech companies to make sure that there were not predatory outcomes of things that people are using now, like Venmo and Cash App and all these fintech products. The bottom line is, I think that we've not come to a place where we see the high risk associated with what we're talking about. And a lot of it has to do with policymakers who are not engineers and engineers who are not policymakers. And I would say one other thing too, and this was mentioned, the White House has been going towards what I think is a really interesting model, which is the White House Bill of Rights. It's still being operationalized, but still, what does that mean? I mean, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission did the same thing and put out guidance for employment algorithms. And they also did the same thing for algorithms that affect people in the disability community. But these are not binding. They're not binding laws, you know? And so our question as the country is the extent to which we trade off these conveniences of these models with essentially the type of guardrails that the EU is putting forth. But the EU, and you know this as well, is putting these guardrails on American companies. So that's like in another conversation for another time. And I do think, you know, we're not there yet in terms of imposing that type of strict scrutiny.
Yeah, and there will hopefully be a positive Brussels effect in the sense that the companies that do have to satisfy these requirements in Europe will also implement at least some of the benefits for American consumers. And one thing I really wanted to emphasize, you mentioned that part of this is kind of driven by the idea that we don't want to interfere too much in the market. Well, you know, the real truth is we have something like 2 or 3 gigantic companies that form a big oligopoly. There is no free market for these things, right? You and I, we can't decide to go from Facebook or Twitter or Instagram to some other platform that has more privacy protections because there just is no competition around that. And,
that's the debate right now. I mean, that's why we need privacy legislation that allows people to have greater portability of their information.
Right, and that would really help.
Capacity, right? I mean, all of these things are in this privacy bill, but we just can't seem to have bipartisan support on what privacy looks like, right? But I do believe, like, for us as a country, it becomes very difficult because there are 2 arguments that we commonly hear. One is, well, our models are proprietary, so we don't want to open the hood or the black box because that will open itself up to competitors. It's very hard to audit algorithmic models if you don't know what's in the black box. So that's the first and foremost. You can know the inputs, you can know the outputs, but algorithms aren't designed like that. As I mentioned, it picks up every attribute. It's like a snake at the end of an ocean. Every particle of sand in some way attracts to the snake's body until they roll it off and go into another digital environment. And some of those remnants still remain. We don't have those things completely deleted. I mean, even when you delete stuff because you make a mistake on one of the social media platforms, it still stays in the cloud. And so I think we still have to deal with issues that Europe has dealt with, which is really things like the right to be forgotten or the right to be deleted in terms of PR. But then there's this other piece, which I think is really interesting. I mean, we're moving from what we're talking about today into artificial intelligence and virtual reality, augmented reality. It applies the same ground rules. It's just a different technology. We as a country need some baseline understanding of what do consumers have agency over and what do they not. Give a great example. I'm doing a lot more AR, VR work as well in terms of the intersection of equity. And we're finding, for example, there's something called a bystander effect in many of these AR, VR environments where things that are not appropriate in public, like groping of a woman that's in a augmented reality situation, is happening there. And so it goes back to that question that we were talking about with this panel. Where do you blur the line of democratic values and the opportunities that are afforded to residents of this country with the technological space? And we just don't have the framework that allows people to have that agency or recourse going forward. And so that's why we're still having conversations about antitrust, but that's not going to solve what we're trying to talk about today.
Yeah, no, and in some ways, these digital technologies, they have these enormous network effects, and they're always going to naturally lead to a few really successful platforms. So whatever antitrust you want, we can't really break them up into, let's say, 100 baby bells or something like that, what we did with AT&T. It doesn't make sense to have a social network for, I don't know, Virginia, because...
Well, and that's the problem with privacy legislation right now.
Yeah.
You have privacy legislation in different states that don't recognize the portability of internet data. So there are some places like in California where you could be in New York and things are permissible, but you go to California and it's not. And so you have to comply, which brings up the other case. The technological ecosystem has always been this untethered, like without walls and boundaries, the lowest point of entry for small business owners and creators and content drivers. But when you start putting on a lot of regulatory overreach, you also bring burden to small businesses. And so it's a very complicated challenge. Yes, we need to regulate to the big actors who, by the way, are no longer Facebook, right? You missed it, they're Meta, right? They're not the company that we thought they were. They're reinventing themselves all of the time. We have to keep up with their reinvention. But at the same time, we have to honor all of the app providers and other people that play into the digital ecosystem that are either trying to do one segment of it or trying to cross across segments. They cannot keep up with the requirements. And so I'm very sensitive to that, particularly for diverse creators who are trying to get into the space. They're constantly trying to figure out how to navigate this landscape, which, you know, like you said, they're not the big mega companies. They're just the people who maybe provide a product to those mega companies, but at the same time, they still can fall victim to the type of algorithmic mining we're talking about.
Yeah, I thought it may be useful for us to kind of dig down a little bit into the details of one set of these algorithms, the social media algorithms that we have already discussed. And yeah, what I guess kind of how should I say, bird's view perspective of how the algorithms work is essentially whenever you or I pull down on our social media feed and refresh, the system has access to trillions and trillions and trillions of posts all over the world, right? And needs to somehow decide what is it going to serve you, what's it going to serve me, what is going to serve anybody on this call or in the world. So it has to solve this gigantic computational problem, and that's why these algorithms are so complex, and also part of why they are so difficult to oversee. Yeah. And I guess right now, the way that it works, and this is a caricature version again, is that first, when you post something, there is like a filter. It doesn't let you post the most egregious things that some people try to put on social media. But if you're just a little bit on the right side of that filter, it still allows people to post some pretty toxic content. And then the second part of the recommender system kicks in, which essentially tries to maximize user engagement, and which unfortunately finds that oftentimes the pretty toxic content that has only barely cleared the hurdle for not getting censored goes viral. So what we have put together is a system that kind of maximally optimizes for engagement, subject to these pretty loose content moderation guidelines, but it really doesn't optimize for social well-being. It doesn't optimize for how can I connect people, how can I essentially create a citizenry that shares a common base of information, and how can I produce a system that generates essentially a more harmonious society at the cost of not always, pinging our system that wants to get a quick adrenaline high when we read the latest exciting post. And I think we would need that kind of system. Imagine when you pull up your favorite social media app and you can toggle a switch between, for example, entertain me or inform me, and you get a completely different system that maximizes based on different criteria. Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, it would be nice, but I don't think that's how the software is designed, right?
Not right now, right?
No, I mean, I liken your analogy to what I share with folks, like a playground. On the playground, there are monkey bars, there's a swing, there's a slide, there's a sandbox.
Right.
And the way that the algorithmic machine works is the people who like monkey bars basically are the cyclists. The people who like the swings are basically, the knitters. The people who are in the sandbox could be the white supremacists. The people who are standing out, sitting on the bench could be the Black Lives Matter people. It is designed to optimize us based on these traits. And that's a problem because there's no way to recalibrate that algorithm or to bring in different dialogue. And so it used to be, you remember, that we always have had hate speech on the internet, right? It always has showed up. I think there's a research study says by like the 10th comment on something that's open. Actually, the research was when Obama was running, by the 10th comment, there would always be something racist. And it was right. There was always a racist comment by the 10th comment in some type of public feed. So hate speech has always been there. It's just that the sophistication of these models has allowed people to fall prey to their communities in ways that are so much tighter. And the technology is now overlaid with neural networks. So it not only, I love the way you put it, right? It not only reinforces your community, but it reinforces your feeling about your community. And that can happen to, again, a white supremacist group. It can happen to young anorexic women in terms of body image issues. And we've allowed our societal creepiness to come into these networks because, again, one, as we've already said, these are nothing but optimized advertising platforms. They are not the public square that we tried to put them into. There are shareholders of these companies that incentivize profit over community. So let's just be clear about that. But then the second thing is we are complicit people in this. We share information that we haven't checked. We go to these communities that we know are not good for us, and we don't speak up. How many of us have been on social media feeds and we don't speak up when we see something awful? I spoke up a couple of weeks ago. I spoke up on something because somebody was criticizing my county school. And I happened to say, well, I like the school. My kids did well. Well, I was open prey to about 5 other parents that did not like what I said. And eventually, the social media etiquette is either you keep going or you stay quiet. So we've not created this conversation that needs to happen in a healthy media ecosystem. And we've relied upon, to your point, these content moderators. I kind of love and hate that commercial that's out there with Facebook or Meta that says, we have millions of content moderators who could fill up a football field. In my mind, I'm thinking, so in other words, you're looking at everything I'm inputting and outputting and making decisions on a daily basis on what you think is good content. That's problematic because that means that people, again, who may or may not have your lived experiences or understand why you did that post, they're checking it, but they're not checking it of consequence. If someone was checking it, there would have been 20 plus kids in Texas, in Uvalde, Texas, that would be alive today because we're finding out about those communities after the fact. We've been surveilling their social media. So my point to your question is social media is a problem, but it's couched within an ecosystem, which is even more problematic. And it's up to us to figure out how do we either inform people that this is like going to the amusement park, right? What you put on there, what you share is part of this experience that you're sort of complicit in. And how do we distinguish between these above the line issues where we want more literacy? We want people more advised. We want other substitutes. A great example of this, and I'll shut up because I'm like a preacher. You get me talking about this stuff, I'm not stopping. I'm just tell you right now. But a great example of this is I have been so impressed by the national attempts to standardized information resources for mental health. When I was growing up, we didn't see mental health advertisements on television. We didn't see at the end of every movie, if you're experiencing domestic violence or mental health, call this number. We didn't see, the FCC put in a line, the Federal Communications Commission, where people could call 311. To me, that's the type of education that we need to do with this, because your content moderator is essentially a paid person sitting in an office, drilling through algorithms of this content. But at the end of the day, you as citizens, that's what first-class digital citizenship entails.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, I've never seen this type of engagement. And I brought this up recently. This is what it looks like when we want our citizenry to be much more aware of these things. We make an effort to make sure that it's on the newspaper, it's on television, it's showing up in social media. Here, we haven't done that.
Yeah, it's interesting, no, because it kind of goes to a question that we just got that I'll pose in a minute, I think, on this question, which is maybe in the direction of what we can do to change things. But Anton, I hadn't ever really thought about it, how much the system does incentivize the post that goes almost over the line, but doesn't go over the line, right? And that's very interesting, I think, right? That because that's the post that's going to go the most viral. In other words, the thing that's going to be the most triggering, or however you want to describe it, the most likely to sort of cause either outrage or fear, or kind of going to go to those parts of the brain, but doesn't cross the line. So we're having, and I would imagine, I wonder if there's studies of this. It feels like you probably are then going to have a clustering effect of those things that are almost right there, right, and not going over in terms of what is more likely to appear on people's feeds. So that seems fascinating. I don't know if there's changes that can be made to kind of alter that. But the question that came from Michael Frazier here is, he says, what are your thoughts about responsibilities of end users to read and post in a responsible manner, right? About critical thinking skills. Isn't it really a shared responsibility about the risks of social discourse? And then he says, I don't delegate the technology the full responsibility for managing that risk. I feel like, Nicole, you were just talking about that may be true, but sort of, is there education that needs to go on because people are dealing with something that they haven't been taught to deal with, right? Or they don't understand what's underlying the discourse they're encountering in order to develop those skills. So I just wonder if either of you have a response to that.
Go ahead, Nicole.
No, I was going to say, I would just, I'll be short. I think we need the education. I think it needs to start in grade school, right? I think there has to be some media democracy that happens there. And then I think for colleges, we need to be teaching what we're talking about today to computer scientists and data scientists who are more binary, that should understand the sociological context and consequence of the work that we're doing.
Interesting.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, I do agree very much with the premise that the individual user bears a really significant responsibility. But I think we also have to keep in mind that we've had lots and lots of people say really stupid things for many decades. And only now do we have these recommender systems, these social media algorithms that specifically pick out sometimes the stupidest voices and amplify them and make them go viral. So I think we can't rely exclusively on individual responsibility, and we need more responsibility by the social media companies. And I also think we do need regulation.
Right. Well, that goes back to, if I can just stay on that goes back to Section 230, which is basically designed as a regulatory gap stop to take the responsibility off of social media companies and to put it on individuals. And so in many respects, even though we're relying on these companies, we actually are still in this very individually encased environment, right? Because at the end of the day, the person who does the action is primarily the person who's either publicly shamed or publicly supported, right? Or goes across the line and operationalizes something that they read. Here in my research, we've been talking a little bit, though, about to the point of the people who go to the edge, that I do think, and we've written about this in Tech Tank, the blog I manage, that there has to be some social responsibility when it comes to federally protected hate speech. So, for example, no one should go on there and say, I think it's funny to lynch people. That is something that has a historical trauma. It also is related to an actual manifestation that happened to groups of people. If it wasn't a public lynching physically, it was a public internment. And I think that there has to be, and the NAACP did this a couple of years ago. It's still being debated, but they basically, wanted to call social media companies out on the KKK Act, which actually talked to specific actions that showed some type of racial or ethnic discrimination, and to push the content moderators to not think it's okay to push it to the edge, but to make it illegal if you actually incited that type of violence based on the fact that you allowed, content that was racially derogatory or ethnically derogatory to exist, or gender derogatory. So I do think like there's some things that can happen with Section 230. There's a big debate on that too. For those of you, if you haven't picked up the theme, a lot of conversation in Washington where we sit and not a lot getting done. But there is some conversation on what really is beyond the edge that we can actually protect in our democratic society.
And I think right now the problem is it's not only not illegal, it's actually precisely that which the algorithm amplifies. So I think we need to distinguish between rights to free speech and whatever, and rights to go viral. And we certainly don't want to get that content viral, right?
No, but that's the thing, it's been happening. I mean, law enforcement plays a role, but it's not something that a content moderator has any clear jurisdiction over to decide if this is something I should omit, question, delete. So for example, when content moderators decided to take down the content of Alex Jones, it was done, I think, maybe on the importation that he was racist, but more so on the importation that he was inciting a lot of other stuff, radicalism that, they didn't want to have. But equally, they also censored the content of other people, right? That they thought fell into that same category, kind of under the radar, where you then have questions. Well, if they can censor Alex Jones, if Martin Luther King was alive today, would they have censored him? So there was a lot of conversation among the civil rights community as who chooses and who gets to decide who gets shut down on these platforms. And again, that goes back to the extent to which you have regulation that allows for some clear parameters of what's acceptable and not acceptable. But it goes back to Loretta's question. But that doesn't sell. That makes them a legally compliant entity that may not be as exciting and cannot sell engagement. Right. And so it's a catch-22 when we have this conversation.
Yeah. Anton, I was curious whether, or both of you really, we have about, maybe 10 minutes left, and I'll invite attendees to also share more questions in the Q&A if you'd like, but thinking about the future, and I know that a lot of your work is thinking about the kind of what's to come in terms of AI, the ways, what effects that's going to have on inequality, what effects that's going to maybe have on labor. There's a lot of questions kind of here. And you started with a kind of dystopian vision of the future. I'm wondering, as you think about the future, whether it's sort of new technologies coming, possible political reconfigurations, where do you see, I know you don't know, but how would you predict the next years to unfold? Or what would you like to have happen that you think will help sort of shore up or protect democracy? Are there ways that algorithms can even serve democracy and be sort of, as you described at the beginning, sort of a source for democratic work? I'm just kind of curious. You can both think about, where, it's two questions. Where do you think we're going, which might be pessimistic? Where would you like us to go, which might be more optimistic? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be excessively dystopian. I don't want to come across as such. I think at a very fundamental level, almost all technology is neutral, and it can be used for objectives that further humanity. It can be used for objectives that deteriorate the human condition. And I am actually quite optimistic and quite hopeful that even AI systems, even social media companies, and all the associated algorithms can be tweaked in a way that actually benefits us. And if we can obtain bad results from recommender systems that are underlying, let's say, Facebook, Instagram, who knows what, then I think we just need to change the sign in some of the algorithms and what they are optimizing for, and we can also obtain good results. And some of the examples that we were talking about, like making recommender systems that explicitly optimize for what brings us together, I think that would be a really important step. And yeah, I think it is a challenge, but it's certainly not an insurmountable challenge for us to develop these kinds of systems. And we need to view the algorithms as part of this broader ecosystem of our democracy. And we need to be very careful and intentful about how the two interact. So I want to pick up on Nicole's example of the playground before, where different people choose to operate in different corners of the playground. And right now, I think the social media companies are at best a security guard who looks away most of the time until something really egregious happens on the playground. What we want instead is we want a nurtureful teacher who helps the people in the different communities to interact with each other, who tries to bring them together. And we want that playground to not split up into corners that are more and more distant from each other, but we want to bring them together. I do think these really powerful technologies, which are getting more powerful basically by the week, they really do have the potential to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I would love to see a technological invention or technology company that actually puts people first when it comes to creating the type of harmonization that my colleague is talking about. But I don't see it happening. And unfortunately, I see government procuring a lot of these models without really doing the due diligence to make sure that they're not replicating systemic inequalities or going backwards. I mean, listen, the challenge that we have today and the political environment that, we feel a little bit that we're not as much entrenched in was really emboldened by the fact that we have the architecture to help us stay socially distant. And the challenge with any algorithm also is that it's being introduced into a society that has, again, a lot of historical past. And so it's very difficult to say, well, the algorithm can work efficiently, again, and this is what I also talk about in the article, if the people who are designing the algorithm do not look like the people that represent the user. So I really feel that there's a problem and disconnect there, because that means that any generally purpose algorithm that's developed by, white male scientists that is applied on women or children or older people or, people of color will be, again, a very passive introduction and passive use by those communities. So I'm optimistic, but less optimistic that we'll see an algorithm that brings everybody together. I see a better space for algorithms if we actually define out the civil and human rights structure that these algorithms sit in. No algorithm should break the housing laws. It should not break the credit preservation laws. It should not break the employment laws. I don't care if it causes more efficiency. Listen, I'll bring another example. We have algorithms right now who are doing pre-screening of applicants before they even get into the door for a job. We're finding that the algorithms are requesting videos of people, again, for the sake of efficiency and the trade-off of the user to get their stuff out there. But Black men and Hispanic men are being denied the ability to even get past the pre-screening because the algorithm looks for things like eye contact and smiling and tone to determine whether there's suitability or fit. Well, those metrics are built by people who don't look like those Black and Hispanic men. And so for me, I actually want to start with how the sausage gets made and who's sitting at the table making it before we start talking about creating algorithms that create a much unified society. If we have a much more diverse workforce working on this, I think we then begin to look at a system of equality that involves the various stakeholders in the design, the implementation, the execution. You know why? Because they got a lot more at stake to make sure that these algorithms perform efficiently and equitably. So I'd like to say that I agree with you, but I don't, because I still think that these models are deployed in contexts that are going to take a long historical path to even get us closer, in line at the grocery store, in some cases, in our communities. And technology cannot solve that. That's not going to provide us with the inflection points for us to really take a quick look at ourselves and understand that this technology is enabling that.
Mm-hmm.
As a sociologist, actually, by the way, speaking,
yeah,
as an economist, which is part of the reason why I love talking to other disciplines, because I think that brings different perspectives on where we stand.
Well, and that historical, sorry, and a historian here, but no, but like that sense of that sense of the historical burden and weight on these sorts of things. So it's not just neutrality, it's sort of really being aware, is if what I understand what you're saying, being very aware of how many contexts are shaping the very granular choices that are made. And I think, I mean, I guess I was going to say, it strikes me that between the two of you, though, it sounds like Anton's saying, and I think you're saying some of this too, it's not that the technology doesn't offer ways of doing this, right? There's nothing in the technology that could prevent it. It's really the will, the incentive structure, but the political will, the kind of the power of the market over that, the lack of a will on the part of representatives or the government, and perhaps because of the deep complexity that you're describing, Nicole, of the question, right? And so that's, I mean, that's both hopeful in a sense. It's not like the machines have to be used for, they're not controlling us. We're actually controlling the machines.
I'm trying to tell
but we're not doing a good job of controlling so far right now, obviously.
But there's the other component, which, I'm going to throw in here because I'm finishing my book on this finally, because it's taken me a very long time because of the changing nature of the digital ecosystem. But there's also the people who are not connected. I mean, we assume everybody is connected in society. The pandemic showed us we had to rely upon physical social isolation, that the only way you could do stuff was being online. And there are a lot of people still stuck in an analog society. My book is on the US digital divide and really looking at glimpses of the global digital divide. And we're assuming that even those people are actively participating in the algorithmic economy. Here's the deal. If you live on the southeast side of DC and you never call an Uber, your community will not get Uber, because ride sharing services, the algorithm is the boss. And it curates, again, the cumulative and repetitive experiences to determine where it goes, where it delivers, who it picks up. We're seeing that. We saw it a couple of years ago in a place like Boston, where we found out the explicit discrimination, where certain drivers wouldn't pick up people based on the photo that appeared as the rider. That was a problem, or they had to wait longer to get their rides. But now the algorithm is also feeding the system of the connected. And so if you're disconnected, yes, you're still a product, you're still part of the data, but you're not going to benefit from the resources that come from being connected. So I think we still have to deal with these equity concerns that the computer can't fix.
Right.
How do you get people to want to save money on an airline ticket or want to go visit a family member on a Greyhound bus, but they're not connected, and they'll never get an advertisement for $50 off, or an advertisement to do pay now, get it now and pay later. We don't have, and this is a constraint that we as researchers have, there's no set place where we can do those comparative analyses to see how people are differentially treated or ultimately disparately impacted by not being connected.
Right. We're just coming all the way up on time, a minute or two. So I want to see if either of you have just a last word or something you want our audience to take away from this. Obviously, so many issues, and I thank you so much for engaging with all these complexities. But Anton?
Yeah, what I wanted to clarify, when I said I am optimistic, that didn't mean to say that I'm making a prediction that the only way for these algorithms to go is that things will get better. But what I'm trying to say is that our society does have the capacity to steer those algorithms in a direction that actually support our democracy and actually bring us together rather than dividing us. And I do think that these interventions that Nicole listed, the system that she proposed in the handbook chapter that we talked about, and, for example, making the workforce that is actually implementing these algorithms much more representative of the people that are ruled by those algorithms. All those steps are very important steps in getting there. So I think we still have the chance to steer the algorithms in the right direction. Should also say the algorithms are getting more and more and more powerful. And we have to make these choices soon while we can.
Yeah, because they also have a national security implication too if we don't.
Mhm.
They could be
Yeah.
used for weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Listen,
Wow.
my last word would be this. Thank you everybody for coming. This is such a complex. Every time I talk about algorithms, I feel like I'm going into like a Twilight Zone conversation because you go deeper and deeper
Right.
and you just can't get out, right? But part of it is I would just say this is I think what we talked about during this conversation is really important. We just have to figure out the right regulatory gap stop. And I think we haven't determined that. Is it the regulation on the software itself? Is the regulation on the accountability part of it? Is the regulation on the pre-inputs? Until we have a conversation of what's the best way, to sort of, and my argument is that we start with privacy legislation, we started somewhere, but we have to figure out like, how do we regulate this? And again, going back to how do we give consumers agency over this? And so that's a part of my work. I'm really like trying to figure out what do participatory models look like?
Yeah. Well, we're so grateful for your research. It sounds like there's so many more conversations to be had and possibilities and empirically based, analysis that's driving your proposals. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for being with us today. We look forward to more conversations, and thank you to our audience as well. We've got another event coming up later in October about changing the forms of representative democracy. So look for that. And again, Nicole and Anton, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.